the mess it created, they'll blame it on tax cuts. They'll blame it on George Bush. So there's no guarantee that in 2012 or 2010 the good guys are going to win again. What happened after '94 when we all thought, boy, Bill Clinton, one-term president. Look what happened in '96. So, don't.
Blake? It's we're bound to ask.
Well, I do have a question. You're obviously very close to the capital markets and Wall Street, and what's your explanation for how all of those supposedly brilliant financiers on Wall Street bought into this subprime mess? How could they have been so naive, and how could they have missed the boat to such a degree?
Well, whenever, two answers. First, whenever you have new instruments come along, there's a painful learning period. Remember, when equities came along in France and Britain, you had the South Sea bubble. You had the Mississippi bubble. In France, they banned equities. In Britain, they almost did, but people ignored the law, and Britain developed capital markets. Commercial paper in this country really boomed in the 1960s. Large companies, mid-sized companies could go around the banks and borrow directly from the markets. They went on a binge with it. Then, none of you are old enough to remember, but in 1970 came the then largest bankruptcy in the world. Penn Central went broke. Big user of commercial paper, the market dried up, scores of major companies about to go under. As a result, you got reform. Among them is if you want to issue commercial paper, you had to have sound lines of bank credit behind it so people could have faith in the paper again. So there's always a learning curve on this. What made it worse in this situation was that with the Fed's extra liquidity, it became a binge. And you see it with products. Look at the personal computer. Remember companies like Atari and Commodore? Huge boom in the early 80s. They all went through a shakeout. Most of them went broke. The head of a then large computer company in '85 said PCs were just a toy. And then suddenly, not only did they become cheaper, but people figured out these things could talk to one another, you could network them, and boom, a true revolution. So in this case, you had all these new instruments, and people you had a lot of liquidity. And so on the housing side, you already had a booming housing market as a result of the tax changes in '98. And demographics. And then with the excess liquidity, people figured out, well, instead of baking in a 1% default rate, well, you could still make money doing a 4% default rate. And the rating agencies got gulled by the idea that people don't walk away from their homes. Well, yes, if they pay for them, they usually don't. But and so this thing went on steroids, and as a result, why check your income? Because with securitization is a good idea. Spread the risk. So a bank doesn't hold one asset. If it goes bad, the bank's in trouble. You spread the risk around. If something goes wrong, everyone takes a little nick instead of a huge hit. With securitization, though, it meant that you made money putting these packages together, so you didn't care what you put in it. You just wanted the fee. So spread the risk, somebody else's problems. Remember the old movie with George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart, George Bailey, the banker. I guess the angel points out to George Bailey, your loan helped the hardware store, your loan helped the farmer, the money was. But now, who knew where the money went? Who knew where the mortgages went? So it was new stuff, and the very computerization meant people thought they were hedging the risk. which is the next thing to hit the markets as the default credit insurance comes unraveled. That'll be the next wave. So they should have learned from what happened with long-term capital 10 years ago, which had 2 Nobel Prize winners putting this stuff together, and the Fed had to step in, the New York Fed did, to save that situation from the banks. But everyone figured, well, we've hedged our risk. Well, it's like in a theater, if everyone's heading for the exit at the same time, you have a problem. You don't figure that everyone else is doing the same thing you are. So it was a mix of things. Stupidity on the banking side, a real desire for fees, and banks trying to get around capital restrictions from the Basel capital requirements, very restrictive, saying, well, if we get this stuff off balance sheet, we get earnings without putting any of our capital at risk. Now they're having to suddenly take it all back. Painful learning process made worse by the bartender. But it is part and parcel. Innovation, this is the thing, innovation always means laws and regulations always have to play catch up, because the innovations always come up with things you just had not anticipated. So and if you have a sound money system, you can more easily cope with learning how you cope with these new things. But securitization in and of itself, it's a good thing. Taking credit cards, debt, and spreading that risk around, not a bad thing. But just like anything overdone, red wine, 1 glass, good for you. 5, you got a problem.
Steve, I have a question. Some of us supported you for president a few years ago. Unfortunately, we didn't make it. But if you were the president, what is the mechanics of getting our dollar back? I know you've written extensively that we need to pay attention to the price of the gold. It's 350, or I think is your magic number, isn't it?
Once upon a time.
Yeah. What is the actual mechanics of getting the dollar back sound, or does the disparity of the dollar and the euro and all these others, is it self-correcting in any way, or do you have to make it happen?
Well, eventually the markets will force it.
Yeah.
If you continue on this, eventually something happens and you're forced to do something. I'm kind of a little surprised it's taken as long as it has.
But if you were president, what would you do?
First you announce it.
You're going to make it happen.
You want a stable dollar. And what that means is that the markets now know there's more risk when you bet against the dollar, because just foreign exchange operations by the Treasury throws uncertainty. The G7 would be glad to cooperate on that. They find this very disruptive. And then the Fed does what they call open market operations, which simply means the Fed sells bonds from its portfolio. When the Fed sells a bond, say it calls up Merrill Lynch and says we have a bond, $1 million bond we want to sell, part of their Treasury holdings, Merrill Lynch sends a check over to the Fed for $1 million. That $1 million disappears from the banking system, just goes poof, out of circulation. When they want to create money, they do the opposite, out of poof, create the money. So sell bonds, soak up some of the excess cash, and tell the markets what you're doing and why you're doing it, so everyone knows. Fair warning, we are going to stabilize the dollar. If you've counted on binging on leverage, deleverage, fair warning. It's not that hard to do, but it starts with the announcement. Then people know, okay, the wink and the nod, letting the dollar go down, those days are over. And by the way, the other central banks have been doing the same thing, less to the extent. The BRICS have done it, not as much as we have. The European Central Bank's been a little better than we have, because the German mentality is still running it. So, right now, don't be surprised if at some point in the next few months the dollar goes below 150 on the euro.
All right, you guys, we're going to have a little event here shortly, so we're going to go and prepare for that.
Thank you all for coming by.
Thank you. This is great.